All right. If everybody can wander toward a seat, don't be shy, head to the front. Wendy Nather is here. She's very friendly. Everybody, front row is wide open. Plenty of seats up front, guys, if you want to join us up here. Okay, great. Well, I want to first off welcome everybody to Duo Tech Talks. We have a very special guest tonight, Ken White. Really happy to have him here. It's going to be a great talk on real-world threats and crypto systems and how to deal with those things. So thank you, Ken, for joining us tonight. Thank you all for attending. Thanks to everybody who's joined us on the live stream. My name is Mike Hanley. I'm the Senior Director of Security here at Duo. This is Duo Tech Talks, which is our monthly Tech Talk series. If you've been here before in Ann Arbor, generally we have a speaker come in about once a month, typically on security topics, though we do tend to cover other things that are not security related as well. And we've also hosted Duo Tech Talks in our other offices in San Mateo, Austin, Texas, and over in London. Before we get started with Ken's talk, any announcements, shout outs, greets from the audience? Zoe?
Hi. There we go. Hi, I'm Zoe, and I think you probably saw the slide up here when we were getting started, but we're hiring. So if you like this office and you like pizza, which is a frequent appearing item at this office, and you love security, you should check it out because we're a pretty great place to work.
Any other shout outs?
There's a healthcare hackathon coming up in June 23rd to 26th. You can find all about it if you Google A2 Health Hacks, or they're on Facebook as well. And they have a monthly, one more monthly mixer and mini hack coming up that'll be announced as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Ted.
Probably all of you already know about this, but A2 New Tech April meeting is next Tuesday, 6:30. It's always the third Tuesday of every month.
Other announcements, shout outs, weather forecasts? Okay, all right. Well, again, thanks everybody for coming. So it's my pleasure to very quickly introduce Ken White. For those of you not familiar with Ken's work, Ken does a substantial amount of work in the crypto space, and the vast majority of it for the public good. If you're not familiar with works like the orchestration of the TrueCrypt audit from several years ago, people lost confidence in a very sort of foundational piece of open source security software. Ken was one of the folks who stepped in to help make sure that that got audited, and he's also currently involved in the OpenSSL audit that's underway. So a lot of exciting work. Ken's also done a lot of other interesting work in consulting and sort of broad scale impact in the security community, so we couldn't be more excited to have him joining us here at Duo tonight to talk about crypto defenses and real world system threats. So without further ado, Ken, thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate it. This is a great turnout. All right, so let's dive in. I've got quite a bit of material to cover, and we can go kind of as deep or sort of as high level as you like, and hopefully we'll take lots of questions at the end. So this is just sort of the general flow I'd like to kind of follow. Just a tiny bit about me. I've got a really weird background. I imagine a lot of people in this room probably have a weird background for how you ended up. My formal training's in computational modeling and imaging and machine learning around signal processing and expert systems. When I was doing some graduate work at NIH, I got involved in some safety critical system work, and then eventually sort of stumbled my way into the healthcare space and clinical research, and ended up working on sort of one of the largest clinical research networks in the world, and owning defense and operations for that. So I spent many years in the Linux and network world sort of get to where I am now. And then more recently, I do spend a lot of work on applied crypto, as Mike indicated. If you're not familiar with it, check out Open Crypto Audit. That's one of the nonprofits I've been involved with, and it's there's some great work we've done there. So let's dive in. So in the world of applied crypto and in security in general, actually more in terms of security in general, we are often misunderstood. This was about a year and a half ago. Actually, I guess, yeah, so about a year and a half ago. This is Ellen Nakashima. She's a pretty well-regarded national security reporter for the Washington Post, and she was quoting Director Comey. And I love this line. So Comey's line was, "There's no doubt the use of encryption is part of terrorist tradecraft now. It's a feature especially of ISIL's or ISIS's tradecraft." To which Matt Blaze responded, "That's true. Crypto is also part of consumer tradecraft, business tradecraft, and critical infrastructure tradecraft." But we see, we see these sort of simple narratives kind of repeated quite a bit. I'm not sure if people are familiar with the American Enterprise Institute. It's a pretty well-regarded, central, maybe slightly right, slightly left, depending on who you talk to, think tank in D.C., but they've got a really deep bench of respected scholars. This came out a few months ago. Title of the story was, "How Data Encryption Helps Terrorists." And I couldn't help myself but click on that little lock. Because if you do click on that little lock, you see your connection to AEI.org is encrypted using modern Cipher Suite. And it was actually a pretty decent Cipher Suite. But so humans are the hard part, right? I saw this little snippet a while back, and I thought this was beautiful. So this guy's has his whole family come in for a Super Bowl party. Like, relatives were driving from all over. They were super excited. And the problem was when they actually went to use their new DVR and get everything going, it just didn't work. He had like an entire box of cables and switches and things, and it just didn't work. So this is what was engineered. On the bottom is a little playing card deck and a camcorder that's shooting at an iPad that's tied into S-video cable. Those people were able to watch the Super Bowl. One of the things I'll talk about a little bit later is in terms of formal methods and verification and formal proofs of security guarantees. The problem is often those are either very circumscribed or they're isolated, sort of absent the larger picture. You can imagine lots of different security threats. I'm not sure how many of us would have thought of this security threat. Right. So we're all, we've all gone through the security training, and we have, hopefully we're sort of aware of phishing, and we're really careful about clicking on suspect links and things. So this was, I think, near the end of last year. IBM, as you can imagine, IBM Global has a really substantial malware R&D group, and they did this. They did a report on this sort of interesting new bot, the Bilal bot malware. Anyway, wrote a whole piece, analysis on it. In the old days, we sort of focused on signatures or maybe heuristics, and there's sort of a standard approach of how you think about adversaries. But it's basically an unknown, actor. In this case, the author of that piece of malware was so incensed that IBM got it wrong, and on some of the particular technical details that he was really proud of, he ended up emailing the lead author of this post, and basically he became his own PR officer, and then he contacted like a whole bunch of different, mainstream sites, like Wired and Ars Technica and things. But I mean, this is the lead security analyst was getting, basically PR pitches from the very malware author, the guy that he wrote. It's just a different way of thinking, right? Yeah, right. He probably. Well, actually, I studied this for an embarrassingly long amount of time. I have no idea what mail program that is. This is a screenshot in the follow-up piece that the guy wrote, and I'm like, is that some Lotus Notes, like ancient thing? Maybe I don't know. So, right. Is it? Oh, that's fantastic. It's GoDaddy's webmail. All right. I've got a whole thing on GoDaddy a little bit later. All right. So, a lot of times we have really creative people on the marketing and product side, but translating security properties and guarantees and some of the technical nuance is difficult. There are innocent mistakes, and then there's sort of snake oil. So this is cyberghostvpn.com. The data you send will all be encrypted with 256-bit encryption, and it might take all those years, or it might take 3 seconds, because it turns out they publish their pre-shared keys, and their default allows null ciphers, and there's just a whole series of other problems. So yes, it might take to the end of eternity, but probably not. This I saw in a survey, I don't remember what the security product was, and I stared at this for a long time, and I thought, how do you not know if you drive a car? And what information was the security company trying to get to? So this is another product that I heard a bit about, Brigade Point of Sale. And their shtick is they sort of integrate with larger points of sale. So these, the credit card swipes at retail stores and things. And their whole thing is that we're the leader in stability and ease of use. And they had this big media story come out, and then when you went to their homepage, you got error establishing a database connection. Yeah. In their case, it was. In their case, it was, yes. Qualifying what things do, what assurances exist, and what protections are afforded versus what may not be afforded. Sometimes people like Dan Guido call these anti-features, and I love that phrase, because if a product talks about NSA proof or hacker proof or some of these sort of silly sloganeering terms, those are signals. They're trust signals. Now, they may be in isolation, but usually they cluster with a whole bunch of other things, and so, But anyway, good UI is critical. This is one of the best examples of UI I've ever seen. Not only will this kill you, it will hurt the entire whole time you're dying. We should all have, UI that crystal clear. This was I thought, a sort of insightful observation that a lot of times when we see sort of defects and maybe catastrophic product failures, or sort of embarrassing examples, that it's not always a technical problem. In fact, in my experience, often it's not a technical problem. It's a decision. It's an incentive trade-off that someone made, that a human being made, and often that's a management decision, which is why when I believe this was New York City, local television station that had just invested over $10 million in high-definition weather satellite gear and forecasting things. During a live broadcast, we got that. Someone at some point made a decision to not put a GPO policy on, to let that one slide, to offload the problem to the contractor. I'm not sure. Not good. I've got a couple of other examples here in terms of communication. This is great. So, what do you think the instructions read to the bakery for that cake? Happy birthday, Kylo, with Darth Vader drawn underneath. It's probably not what they really intended. The other one, this is one of my favorites, is guy goes into a bakery, has a picture, because modern bakeries have these inkjet printers that are kind of like icing jet printers, right? And said, I'd like the cake to look like this. So they made the cake look like the USB stick the guy handed. Okay. All right. So there are things that happen where we think we have an understanding of what we call security boundaries or trust boundaries. There is this notion, I suspect it's not quite as prevalent here, but I see this a lot in the Fortune 500 with systems people or ops people who make this really strict delineation between open source and sort of commercial or off-the-shelf proprietary systems. You get this a lot in like the hardware and hardware network sort of space. Cisco, for example. So I've had these conversations with system administrators where it's like, no, I don't deal with open source. I'm, strictly like a Cisco guy. Strictly a Cisco guy. Let's break that down. Because on my phone, when I have a Cisco VPN, in your about statement, you've got credits for OpenSSL and libcurl. So you are running, actually, lots of software that you may not be aware of. There's this notion of supply chain, right? So where chips come from, where processors come from, where maybe different OEM kind of integrations happen, whether it's software or hardware. But there's also this notion of a security supply chain, and I think we should think about that more often, because even people who have been like really experienced Linux administrators or system people for years, they may not really quite appreciate how many levels of dependencies in the stack and things that have been sort of untouched for years. That's one of the reasons that we worked with the Linux Foundation's Core Infrastructure Initiative to work on the OpenSSL project. But there's lots of others. libcurl is one of the sort of cornerstone pieces that lives everywhere. And also, people have this mindset sometimes. I thought this was an interesting thing. If you talk to, so I don't know if people are familiar with the FizzBuzz test, right? So if you're a deeply geeky engineer, you know that some companies use this as sort of like an interview question. It's a simple programming problem, which is, it's meant to see if you can understand some basic operations of looping and modulus constructions, things like that. Anyway, I've heard these conversations between people that are like, well, I do real programming versus design or HTML or CSS or modern DOM development. Okay, well, this is CSS, straight CSS that can solve the FizzBuzz, right? It's Turing complete. The basics of sort of skinning the cosmetic appearance of a page, that's been long since bypassed. I mean, some of these are deeply nuanced technical, skill sets. How about this one? This is the bane of web design, web application everywhere, right? And by the way, for the record, I'm either crazy enough or dumb enough to have actually worked on a system that was JavaScript and DOM-based that did cardiovascular analysis. And so had to worry about things like microvolts and microseconds on EKG waveforms and things like this, which are crucially different. But let's talk about threat models. What does that mean exactly? Because security people say that a lot. Well, the first thing is it means understand your adversary. Is your adversary the nuclear sub or the dolphin? How about this one? No chew deterrent. This was an example of not understanding your adversary, at least bad product design. I'm not sure which. In terms of trust signals, a lot of times when we look at maybe a promising application on mobile or a tablet, people put some degree of faith, maybe with some skepticism, in the ranking systems online, right? Which apps are quite popular. I think Apple, when they first started out, by the way, just a historical point, when the iPhone first came out, there was no App Store. Actually, there was a whole lot of things that you have now that wasn't on the first Apple iPhone, excuse me. But when the App Store was put in place, I guarantee you some really, really smart people sat around and thought about potential threats and vulnerabilities and so forth. But I'm not sure they thought about this one. So this is a person going through and putting in fake reviews, but from real devices that have actually been registered per device to game the Play Store. And we've seen similar things with iOS apps. And then let's talk about users, right? Rocks, riptides kill unwary Asian visitors on Australian beaches. Look at that guy on the left. Well, we can mitigate that, right? There's a sign. All right. But these things are trade-offs, right? So we talk about engineering trade-offs. Sometimes risk is is worth the reward. In this kid's case, she was going for it. I love that face. So a few months ago, there was an announcement that I think on the order of 850,000, 900,000 routers in Germany were rooted and were forming botnets. And so when people dove into it, one of the most common home routers for cable company in Germany had, I don't know if this was well documented, if this was meant for manufacturer updates, I'm not sure, but basically on a single post, on a single HTTP post, properly crafted, what was supposed to be a SOAP envelope, you could just run arbitrary shell script, right? You could just backtick and run and get a payload, do a dropper, bring it down, so on. But threats vary tremendously by intent, right? Your threat is probably not my threat. My threat is definitely not the people on the left, because I'm never going to do that, just for the record. I'm not going to jump out of a plane with that. Let's talk about snake oil. And people know that term in general, right? So it's from the days of the Wild West, when people would sell these potions or liniments or whatever that were promised to do all kinds of crazy things. We see that a lot in the product security, in the security product space. Justin Shu from Google had this fantastic quote, which is, when I talk to to people about security products, this is a helpful start. I love the helmet too. I mentioned before about trust signals, right? If any of you follow me on Twitter, I for some reason I've sort of become drawn to like a moth to light with really bad VPNs and really bad products and things. But part of the thing that I've discovered in seeing how like a cesspool the consumer VPN service provider space is it finally occurred to me that you can put aside the technical characteristics or signals. It's crucially important to understand the business signals too, right? The ethics signals, the trust signals. Because if you say, for example, you have battle-tested military-grade encryption, I'm going to think of this. I'm not going to think of this. And this is actually probably the more real threat when you're, for example, traveling in a really sketchy hotspot. It's hard to read this, so I'll do this kind of from the inside out. My Uber driver was describing how drivers coordinate to engineer surge prices. Say a big event finishes, drivers know this, so they shut off in unison. Algorithm responds with a surge pricing because of an artificial fall in supply. Then drivers turn on the app and snap up the rides at a higher rate. And someone says, humans are adaptive. Wells Fargo, if you remember the story from, I think, a year ago or so, so 5,300 employees were fired for making up accounts. So customers would come in and they'd just make up accounts and create checking accounts and create other things without actually bothering to tell people, because there's some weird sales incentive or compensation incentive or something. Thousands of people did this for like years. Anyway, the top line is the most important one, which is give humans a system and they'll game at the end, period. I like that. Humans will always game the system. We have to think about this in a lot of different ways, right? How many of us do worry about tainted input on web forms or public-facing interfaces, whether it's an API endpoint or some other kind of web service? Do you blacklist or whitelist? There's no unicycle rule, right? Humans will always game the system. This is what I've sort of come to assume that most adversaries do. Some are really sophisticated and some just break things. I saw this last spring for filing, and I thought he was sort of joking, right? So to get Tadeg O'Higgins, with an apostrophe in his name. He says, it's 2016 TurboTax, you just lost a customer. And he has a little screenshot of last name O'Higgins, and it says invalid entry. And I was like, all right. Well, so I clicked on his profile. Now he really is from Ireland. And I was like, it can't be that bad. So this was like 6 months later, I went to check. Yeah, it's still bad. So they're blocking hyphens. And why do you think they might be blocking hyphens on a web form? Because somebody believes that somewhere downstream that's going to be rendered, and maybe you could do bad things. Maybe you could do cross-site scripting. Maybe you could do other kinds of bad things. That is a terrible, terrible way to design it, much less to attract customers. And plus, it's futile anyway, right? 70 different unique ways to encode the less than symbol in HTML. Maybe you need to work on filters and templates and data flow modeling throughout an application rather than trying to stop what could be a trivial sort of switch into a different translation. Let's talk about history a little bit. So I posted this a few months ago. This is one of the stranger things I've seen. Now, if you've been playing in the network world or you sort of know your BSD history, you know that one of the few remote exploits for OpenBSD was in their IPv6 implementation. This is below TCP/UDP, this is layer 3. So just having a server, no open sockets needed, you get exploited. But I'm not talking about OpenBSD. I'm talking about an Internet of Things embedded piece of hardware that made the same mistake about 10 years later, right? So this is latest, greatest, you order it. These are tiny little embedded crypto chips and hardware chips that have embedded, purpose-built network stacks, purpose-built operating systems. This is the most fundamental, basic level of, part of the stack. And this vendor was basically reinventing the wheel in terms of this vulnerability from, 2007. Let's talk about Windows. Because, by the way, this isn't in any way meant to slam sort of the Linux family or, heritage or whatever. You see this about once every year and a half or so. If the phrase in a Patch Tuesday uses the phrase all versions of Windows, there's always something interesting going on. So this example is what a sophisticated attacker would have to do to exploit this particular one. This was a media file extension that went all the way back to, I'm not sure if it was Windows 98, but definitely Windows 2000. And basically a single text line, call that, and you could run, local privileged executables, but through a web page. Ouch. There are dependencies, and there's core code, and there's sort of, critical, well-established, but kind of uninspected, unlooked at, sort of ignored pieces in all of these operating systems. Let's talk about deserialization. If you're into OWASP or you're a CISSP type person, this is probably second, old hat. So deserialization is the way in which applications will take streams of data and basically parse them and use them. The problem is there are many, many examples. Oracle quarterly puts out around 180, 200 remote exploits every quarter, like clockwork, across their whole product suite because somewhere in the Java stack, there's unfiltered, what was assumed to be trusted data, which is actually used to execute code. This is just a tiny sample of some of the products involved. On the commercial side, I mean, this hits everything. This is the Fortune 500, and this is the gift that keeps on giving because it's not like, it's like people are going to rip out their payroll systems or rip out their SAP implementations. These are fundamental, difficult problems, which require a really different way kind of a thinking in terms of public-facing pieces. As I said, they're everywhere. Now, you might be saying, all right, well, I love this expression. It's a Polish idiom, not my circus, not my monkey. You might be saying, well, that's not my problem. I'm a actual security engineer. I'm an actual, developer. That's fine, but we don't deal with these. But you should be thinking about it, because a lot of times this expression they teach in medical school to first-year medical students. If you hear hoofbeats, maybe you should think of horses instead of zebras, right? The postmortems on 100 different engagements from Praetorian, this was done like a year ago, I think. These aren't super sophisticated, right? Some of these date back to the 90s in terms of vulnerabilities in the systems. You're like, all right, let's get onto the crypto. What does this have to do with crypto? One of the things it has to do with crypto is one small part of a tool. It's one tactic that can be used in a larger understanding of threats and different adversarial spaces. But crypto is a little special. So Maciej Siglowski, I don't know if you guys know Penboard. It's like a bookmarking site. Anyway, he's a really fantastic, the guy that founded it is sort of a pretty well-known kind of internet celebrity for his writing. This is one of the best quotes I've ever read on crypto. He's talking about the Matasano Crypto Pals Challenge. So if you're not familiar, this was something that Thomas Ptasek and a couple other people, while they were at Matasano, put together. And it's like an increasingly difficult series of problems. They're open to the world. Anybody can try it, even if you have like no background in programming, or even if if maybe you're really skilled in Python or Java or something. It's a great excuse to like learn a new language. So it starts out. Here's a line from I think it's a Vanilla Ice rap song or something like here's just a simple sentence, encode it in base 64. Here's a simple sentence, convert it to perform a hash on it. Like very basic, simple things, and it kind of advances to manipulating things and doing padding oracle attacks and interesting, other kind of attacks and things. But you sort of progressively build up to it. Anyway, as he's working through this is his write-up on that sort of journey that he went through. There's no difference from the attacker's point of view between gross and tiny errors. Both of them are equally exploitable. In at least 3 of the challenges, the mere fact of getting distinguishable error messages was enough to recover the entire message. In other words, to break the entire crypto. This lesson is very hard to internalize. In the real world, if you build a bookshelf and forget to tighten one of the screws all the way, it does not burn down your house. Absolutely true. We see this all the time with some of the incremental changes that have happened with SSL. We'll get into that in just a second. All right, so let's kind of dive in. I've got a map a few slides back, and folks are welcome to pull that from GitHub. It's it's a pretty decent vector map that you can like zoom in and stuff. These are kind of ways that I've been thinking about modern crypto defense as sort of broad categories, right? So we worry and think about ways to protect data coming across the network. We think about how we can protect disk and volume. We worry about how we can protect files. How about memory encryption? How about data and use encryption and hardware security modules? So let's dive into that. And I'll spend a fair amount of time on this. I imagine as crypto goes, that network transport is probably something that people care about a lot. It's certainly something I've been focusing on quite a bit. SSL, TLS, IPsec, VPNs, SSH. These are common tools and protocols that we use all the time. What are some of the guarantees? What are some of the properties of these things? Well, data exposure, right? Network intercept, credential theft, identity theft, so on. But compliance is also worth thinking about. I used to think compliance in sort of a different way. I actually think of it as an adversary now. Because if you've done audits and kind of real-world inspections, a lot of times you'll see organizations, you see this in the government, you see it in sort of larger, Fortune 500 companies. It's as if there's a checklist mentality. right? It's as if meeting the compliance by itself is enough when I think hopefully everybody in the room knows that what the real goal is actual security, right? Is to keep the bad guys out and keep customer data safe. But so in that sense, I think of it as an adversary because there are things that sometimes you're required to do that may not make sense. And so we'll talk about that in a second. This is a map of Internet Explorer, Firefox, and Chrome common root certificate authorities and the sort of literal web of trust among those that are kind of defaults that are installed in modern browsers. I'll get back to this in just a second, but bracket that for a second. Did you know that, so when you install Ubuntu, for example, one of the defaults is localhost.local domain, right? I mean, it's a very common thing if you've installed VMs before. There's an entire top-level global domain called .host. I registered local domain.host. You can, in one of the attacks that we've seen, there are variations with, what are they called, homomorphic attacks where, like Gmail, but with a Cyrillic I, or Google Service Account or something with like, slightly off, a different character base. That's kind of weird. So I'm not sure if people followed the WoSign story a while ago. This was a few months back. WoSign is a major certificate authority. It was trusted by your Android, your iPhone, all the modern operating systems. They issued bogus certificates for GitHub and for, I think, the University of California and a couple others. And when people went to sort of do the investigation on how some of these certificates were issued, it led to this whole chain of kind of like a comedy of errors to the point where they were actually pulled from the root stores from some of the major browsers. It's sort of the nuclear option if your business is, certificate authorities. Ivan Ristic, if you know the OpenSSL, the SSL Labs test, this is a great model. We'll have links afterwards, but this is sort of his view of kind of the threat architecture and threat map for SSL and some of the properties that's guaranteed. Let's talk about integrity. We've seen a lot of stories with funky names, right, like Freak and Poodle and some of these other things that have made the headlines. One of the things that we've discovered over the last several years is that some of our assumptions about the way that block encryption works, for example, over the web with HTTPS, TLS, were naive. Because I think people know this, but just to reiterate, AES, for example, it doesn't encrypt files, right? It doesn't encrypt any sizable amount of data. It encrypts a few bytes at a time. And so any implementation has to take, whether it's a short string, a long string, a binary string, a file, whatever it is, and put in chunks and block these together, deal with padding, maybe deal with compression, and do it in such a way that the receiver can make sense of it. There's been a whole history with unauthenticated block modes. So this is another reason why if you actually think about what things mean, so when you see product literature that talks about we have AES at the 256-bit security level, it's kind of like saying you have a V6, and so your car has to be great. It has nothing to do with if your car is great or not. It's one tiny element which can be screwed up in a whole lot of different ways. There's a project called ZeroDB. It's supposed to be, it's a way of somewhere between tokenizing and property preserving encryption that made a lot of interesting promises. They sort of held back for like a year and a half after they launched before opening up to the source code. And when they did, I think within the first 24 hours or so, this was a thread on Reddit, but someone took a look and said, this is really broken. This is broken because you're not using authenticated blocks, which means if your cookie says, for example, username Bob, admin 0, I can literally do a really simple XOR and change your cookie to admin equals 1, or my cookie to admin equals 1. That's a problem. We can't talk about, there's not time to sort of get into all the different implementations of sort of modern cipher suites, but let's spend a second on these. So when I think in my mind about real world endpoint TLS, it's this. It's sort of the DevOps folks. Like what are the actual environments, platforms, tools that we're talking about? Web servers, proxy. We're seeing more systems written in Go. Excuse me. The Elastic Load Balancer with AWS, CloudFront, and so on, and global CDNs. Has anyone, just roughly by show of hands, configured an SSL web server before? Some of these look familiar. Anybody get this feeling that like there's an unbelievable amount of too many options that you have no idea what any of them mean? Well, you're not alone. There are people who talk about crypto flexibility, or there's a way to confuse modularity, which in general with systems and programming is a good thing, right? As we're all taught, but with unnecessary and dangerous options. So right now, you're probably not going to see a few of these. And by the way, Twofish and Blowfish. Blowfish, it doesn't really apply to TLS. It is an option for VPNs, but I've seen some bizarre, bespoke atrocities in PHP and other things that were done with Blowfish to like sort of a homemade TLS. And you can call anything, any acronym you want, I guess. But so that really is more applicable to VPNs. But so let's assume that in 2017 we're not talking about SSL anymore. I use SSL, by the way, as sort of a catch-all, and a pedantic person would say, well, no, that's not really true. We came like this close to naming TLS 1.3 SSL 4. So if you really want to get pedantic, I'm happy to sit with you for a few cold beverages and have that conversation. Triple DES and RC4, totally broken, right? Even 2 years ago, myself, Red Hat, lots of people and organizations were still saying, this is a hanger-on. These are pieces of encryption, cipher suites that we need to use for XP, for older Android, and so forth. In 2017, that's not so true. But here's some things that you may not know. RSA is deprecated. Not RSA certificates. Those are going to be with us for, until my grandkids are around, I think. But RSA handshakes. You may be thinking you're crazy. That's RSA. Like what? No. There are, now I think in the 19th draft, we'll see it in a second, the new TLS standard, RSA not allowed. Just not allowed as a handshake. And in fact, even Diffie-Hellman is deprecated. What? Well, static Diffie-Hellman, not ephemeral curve Diffie-Hellman. CBC is probably 60% of, or more of the world's, network block mode chain, block mode. No. CBC is a problem. CBC's been a problem for many, many years. If some of these names look familiar, Beast, Crime, Time, Breach, Lucky 13, so forth, it's because we've been monkey patching a lot of things, but fundamentally, the way in which you construct more than just a few bytes at a time, even some of the best in the business get it wrong and have gotten it wrong. And every major operating system and every mobile carrier and every big network company gets it wrong and has, to the point where the defaults and what were allowed in SSL3, for example, we just said you can't, SSL3 is deprecated. You can't use it. How about Triple Des and Blowfish? Yeah, they're broken. This was, I think, 4 or 5 months ago, right? The Suite 32 attack. That said, there are some caveats, right? This is probably not your biggest problem. This is a quote from the Suite 32 team. So we show the network attacker who can monitor a long-lived Triple Des HTTPS connection to a web browser, and a website can recover secure cookies by capturing around, how many? 785 gigabytes of JavaScript traffic. Now, if you've got one attacker that's hitting your web server with 785 gigabytes of traffic to recover a cookie, I would hope you block them before they've gotten to the terabyte level, but that's probably not really your adversary. But the game is rigged, right? Because how do you know? And good data are hard. This is the Verizon data breach investigation report from last year. It's, I think, generally considered like, really well-respected, credible source of industry information. One of their top 10 exploits was Freak. So they claim. This is a quote from Dan Guido at Trail of Bits Lab, and it's true. What happened was, between some of the research down the street at the University of Michigan and basic ancient network gear, they were getting false positives. False positives so much so that they were listing one of these fairly esoteric, if we'll say, attacks as one of the top 10 that companies were encountering. That's not true. Anyway, back to our TLS stack, right? So in addition to the protocol and the cipher, the key exchange, how we look at integrity, the modes and the certificates, there's a whole host. I've got like 4 of these here. There's maybe 8, 9 other kind of extensions, enhancements to the TLS protocols that have kind of come along. You're going to be seeing more and more about it. I think people are starting to think about, and we're seeing more implementations of native pinning and HTTP/KP pinning. The idea is that, for example, when Facebook or Gmail or like a major web property or application wants to make a secure connection, it's not just any certificate. It's tied and fingerprinted to that certificate that they've issued. Now, that's really powerful. I'm not going to get into it now, but there's like a day or two ago on Twitter, I posted about, I don't know, half a dozen different man-in-the-middles at airports, a lot of them in Central Asia, and a lot of them at like Marriott's and other hotspots and things. And it's a problem because even on like GoGo Wi-Fi, they were generating in real time Google certificates, calling it google.com, but they didn't do a great job, and it was kind of broken, and they happened to hit one of Google Chrome's senior engineering people who, on a plane ride, said, wait, why is GoGo.com issuing a Google certificate? So anyway, there's a whole sort of ecosystem of people thinking about ways to kind of bring these together and enhance the security posture. TLS-1, there are mitigations we can do on browser side, but I mean, I think going forward, we sort of have to consider that kind of gone, unless you really, really have to support, developing areas where XP and like Android 2 clients are still around. That's just gone. Yeah. So if you were building a new stack, if you're building a new application, designing mobile endpoints, this is a practical matter. There are an infinite number of other primitive constructions that you could use, but in terms of S-channel with Microsoft, in terms of AWS's endpoints, in terms of iOS, Core Crypto, and so on. This is kind of what you've got right now. It's not great. Our options are kind of limited. As I said, the TLS 1.3 draft 19 was just published. I think it's pretty much done. There may be some tweaking, but I think we're pretty close. Here are a few things, just some top-level highlights. You must implement GCM AES, which is an authenticated cipher suite. You should implement, among others, the Cha-Cha Poly. So Cha-Cha is an alternative to AES, which is dramatically faster, even on similar hardware. A lot of smaller devices don't have decent AES acceleration hardware, and so it's really useful in that case. And the Poly 1305 construct must support digital signatures, meaning elliptic curve DSA and traditional RSA certs. You have to support the NIST, at least one of those curves, the P256, and then the 25519. So, point in time kind of advice, because these things are moving, right? Prefer forward secret authenticated encryption with associated data ahead of others. If possible, explicitly declare cipher suites versus wildcards. You see a lot of times on Stack Overflow and blogs and things. This is directed toward the DevOps folks, where you sort of say like exclamation point, RC4, or wildcards, which kind of give you this whole universe of possible constructions. That's not recommended. It's recommended to explicitly describe, for example, some of those suites. As I said, CBC should be one of the last trusted in terms of server preference order. Right? So just a little more fill there. If you've seen some of the strings on the bottom, TLS, EC, DHE, blah, 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 this is more for some of the ops folks that have struggled with this, because if you've stared at it for years but you've never really quite understood like what different pieces are, I've got some links at the end which will, I think, make this hopefully more sane and more predictable. And it literally, with these 5 suites, depending whether you're using a DSA or RSA certificate, that's it. You could support 99.9% of the modern and slightly crufty web right now with those. Not some giant sort of thing. If you want the giant thing, or your eyes have already glazed over like 5 minutes ago, just go to Mozilla's SSL generator and read the docs. Let's talk about VPNs. I get this all the time, that VPNs, because of some of the marketing and things, that this is how you get anonymity, this is how you get privacy. No. What you get is, you're at a hotspot and you trust not the guy next to you, or at a hotel and someone 3 rooms down who likes to download lots of free screensavers or whatever, and like is a walking malware lab, and you don't want that. A lot of VPNs, by the way, and I'll say this too, don't just run from any free VPN service, because it's almost guaranteed you're going to be part of a bot mesh network, and you're the product for that. But anyway, in terms of the commercial service providers, these are really hard things to do, to run at scale proxies with fairly complicated network setups. And we've seen repeatedly where you're not only trusting the endpoint, their virtual server in Germany or Switzerland or wherever, you've opened up your internal interface. So that means 150 people that are on that particular node, they're seeing your inside home network. It's dual home, it's dual bridged. Like, that's how broken some of these things are. So what do VPNs actually provide? they're just shifting the trust endpoint. They may provide, if they're done properly, confidentiality via encryption, but for what it's worth, about 1 in 6 Android VPN apps, they don't even encrypt. They don't encrypt. I've got a link at the bottom. There's a research study that came out a couple months ago. It's a disaster. They do not guarantee anonymity and privacy with this caveat, right? I suppose in isolation, if you have a clean, you paid with Bitcoin or cash at Best Buy and you weren't on camera and you trust that laptop and you do all this stuff and that's it, and you go to like one site, yeah, you have some properties of this, but nobody does that, right? Nobody does that. They turn the VPN on, they forget about it, and they log into Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and, right. All right, so enough of the mini rant. Let's go on to some other crypto defenses in terms of disk and volume. Why do you care? Why would you care about locking these things down? If we're not talking about laptops, well, actually, let's talk about laptops for a second. One of the best use cases for disk encryption, for whole volume encryption, is laptops. Because if you've got PII, you've got HIPAA covered data, you leave your laptop in a cab, that's an awkward conversation with your IT folks and a new laptop, and then you're done. If it's not encrypted, that might be Office of Civil Rights with HHS and a multi-million-dollar problem. So flip on full disk encryption. But putting the laptop piece aside, let's talk about servers. Let's talk about points of service. I don't know if you guys know this. Marco Amat. He created Instapaper. He's one of the I think the original founder, one of the CTOs of Tumblr. This was like a year and a half, 2 years ago. His phone starts going nuts with messages because his Instapaper service is just down. It's kind of a bookmarking site, but it's really cool and well designed and all this stuff. Turned out Marco was fine. He wasn't doing anything wrong. But somebody who was doing not nice things at Marco's web hosting company on the same rack got a visit by the feds, and so they took the whole rack, including Marco's. That's probably the more common kind of thing, right? But on the other hand, there are things like government and civil capture, e-discovery, these kind of things. If there are data that are mirrored, you probably want to have full transparency into that. You probably don't want to have that happen without your knowledge, right? So there are lots of, in a shared infrastructure environment, Amazon, Google, so forth, are probably not quite as applicable as more like the regional data centers. But this stuff happens all the time. The other thing that we do worry about is, what about the cloud apocalypse, right? What if we break out of Zen or KVM or whatever the virtualization piece is, and whoever happens to be on your node can now see your stuff, right? To their credit, Google with Zen Amazon with Zen and Google with their compute engine, they've got heavily customized versions of Zen and KVM respectively. But a lot of people don't. A lot of mid-level and sort of other players don't. They're just running like stock Zen. And so, we do have breaks because weird things happen, like strange sound blaster emulators and other kind of weird, QEMU device drivers get exploited. And so you have these, escalations where basically one of the other people that are sharing your cloud instance could break out. Multi-tenant media reuse. The other thing, too, is I covered a story in Wired about 2 years ago. I was on, let's call it a top 5 cloud providers server. And I don't even remember why I did this exactly, but I I was mucking around with dmcrypt, and I meant to do the Unix cat command on this encrypted volume to test something, but I ended up doing it on basically the raw volume that you get. And I was getting people's passwords and usernames and weird, like, My Little Pony kind of stuff. And I'm like, what is this? The cloud provider wasn't initializing the hard drives between customers, right? So you'd spin up an instance, you'd run your web server, you'd do whatever you're going to do, and then you turn it off, right? That's the use case for most clouds, right? They didn't initialize the drive. And so whatever was written by whoever happened to be on that hard drive on that cloud provider, I literally was seeing, like, you know, the good. So that's another great reason why you might want to do full volume encryption. In the case of Amazon and Google, they've made attestations to the Defense Department, to the federal government, from their senior executives under risk of going to prison if they're misrepresenting about their controls around how they rip disks out and how they destroy them and so forth. So I think you're probably okay, but every other provider and in anything that you're doing in-house in terms of your own hosting, disks get repurposed, servers, maybe you don't care about getting stolen, but disks die, they end up in a box, maybe they end up in another box, maybe they end up in another room, and then at some point, maybe they get trashed, or maybe they end up on Craigslist or eBay, and if you don't have full volume encryption, that's a problem. Content repudiation, I don't think that's quite as relevant, but the idea there is that there is information on a machine that you want to be able to point to specifically and say, that is my data or it's not. And so encryption can help in that sense. Data at rest compliance, that's just a given. If you've got the standard practices for HIPAA protected data, for example, are you encrypt your disks at rest. Adversarial admin, incompetence, live vMotion. vMotion is interesting. So do people know about this, live vMotion? VMware created the original, I believe, created the original sort of version of this. The idea is that you're running a live machine, you've got dozens, hundreds of processes, you're listening on network ports, you're running a database. In real time, this technology captures the state of the CPU, the state of memory, the state of the hard drive, and the state of all processes, moves it to another machine live with like binary deltas, and you don't have to reboot. There's like black magic voodoo in there that I don't really understand. But one of the things that occurs to me is, well, what if so when we move those data from the disks are coming over too, we trust ourselves, we trust point A, point B, but do we trust the person in between? And I don't mean trust in like there's a black van I'm paranoid about outside. I mean trust is in like to do the right thing, but not just on disk. So if you think about it, now Google has a similar, I'm not sure how it's branded, but a similar like no downtime kind of feature for some of their cloud instances. But that means that they're taking memory and running processes and managing it on your behalf and moving it. So if you've got, for example, sensitive data, confidential information, keys, whatever, you're trusting them. There's a whole host of reasons you probably, like you've already trusted so much and sort of delegated so much already, but that is another use case. Memory encryption. Cold boot attacks. So I don't know if folks are familiar with this. You don't see this quite as much, but the idea is that when memory fades, it takes between seconds and minutes, and if you're like a really determined adversary, you can physically take memory out of a machine and bring it back up. It's more kind of like, James Bond-ish stuff. Really, if Langley or like Fort Meade is your adversary, this is the last thing you need to worry about. Multi-tenant reuse. So on a big host virtual machine, memory's chopped up. What if there's a break? What if there's a puncture through that? What if another person sitting on that instance can get host and then back into your live memory? That actually has happened a few times. As I mentioned, the live memory snapshots. There's not a whole lot I can talk about that's happening. There's a company called Private Core, Facebook acquired about 2 years. Incredible technology, and I hope they open source it. But they were literally doing like layer 2 cache on chip, on CPU encryption. In other words, the memory that's used for layer 2 cache was actually being used to encrypt and decrypt on the fly, so that raw memory was encrypted natively. Very cool technology. But I haven't seen a whole lot of other sort of similar solutions to that. Data and use encryption. This is transparent data encryption, property preserving encryption. There's some interesting developments, but I think it was the December Real World Crypto at Stanford, or maybe it was New York. But anyway, there are academically promising things that are happening, but in terms of the actual commercial product space for property preserving encryption, so the idea is that you could have social security numbers, credit card numbers, things like this. You could sort them, even though they're encrypted. Even though you're blind to what they are, you can still do those operations on it. We're still struggling to get a performant, decent solution for that. It's to the point that there are at least a couple of commercial solutions where it's a glorified XOR, it's a glorified Caesar cipher to break that stuff, right? So there's some interesting things happening academically, but I'm not seeing a whole lot that's super trustworthy out. Black box custodian is another use of this. I see this at some defense installations, some financial institutions where, for example, you have a big Oracle implementation. You've got a system DBA, an application DBA, a privilege DBA, and different table spaces are encrypted both on disk and in memory in such a way that the theory goes all but the master key holder are blind to other people's information. It's all about delegating trust, because at some point there's going to be a key master, and if that person's untrustworthy, they can do bad things. The last piece on hardware security module, I do want to leave a few minutes for questions, so we'll wrap it up pretty quickly here. If you haven't been following this too closely, I don't mean hardware security modules that cost like thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars that are like NIST certified. I mean hardware security modules in the sense of you get them by the hundreds or thousands on a tape reel that are like $1, $2 now in volume for a pretty capable hardware security module. Financial institutions, a lot of regulated spaces use the sort of NIST blessed, the FIPS compliant hardware security modules. They do it for some of these reasons, right? It's delegating and making it very difficult, so the thinking goes, to steal keys, to have seeds for token generation and so forth. Do you guys have, I don't know if I can even ask that, but are you looking, or do you have aware, I mean, are there HSMs here, or do you have proprietary? Right. Yeah, we should probably talk later, because there are some just staggeringly bad implementations of HSMs in the commercial market that you'd think for like $100,000 you'd get better than an 8-year-old version of Debian that's unpatched and can be rooted, but that's another conversation. So this is how these are some sort of top-level things, ways I've been thinking about some of the crypto defenses. There's a map at the end. This kind of maps it out into those top-level areas. There's some more specifics in here and at the links at the end. I don't know if you guys know this guy, excuse me, Anj Bertolini. He was one of the people on the SHA collision team. He's also like a brilliant graphics artist. He's a crazy, really good security researcher and applied crypto guy and great artist. he was playing around with this this diagram, and they came up with like the, the cyber version. I thought it was kind of cool. I was thinking for, the display purposes, but Anj wasn't thinking that way. Anj was thinking, well, we could do a polyglot that's both a GIF and HTML, or PDF and JavaScript. So, what? What? Excuse me. Script source equals polyglot, blah, 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 dot GIF. Image source equals polyglot dot GIF. What? You can use a GIF as a basis for JavaScript execution? Yes, you can. So if you download my diagram, you can either run it as in your browser with an HTML extension that'll say "Hello World," or you can just view it. But that's crazy stuff. This was before the SHA-1 collision. That's the same file, by the way. That's what the trick is. I'll just go through these super quick. So there are a couple things to be aware of. I love this formal software verification. The DARPA drone project, I don't know if people are aware of this broadly, but so this took place like 2 or 3 years ago. It got a tiny bit of splash, but not a whole lot. DARPA does all these kind of interesting innovation awards, the Defense Department sort of R&D group. They had this question, which was, could you make one of these little quadricopter drones, could you do a fully formally verified drone? And so got together people that are in formal methods and verification and mobile security and guidance systems. And in the span of like 18 months, they built an entire, from the ground up, fully verified little drone that has formally verified navigation, geolocation, instrumentation, communications, from the ground up rewritten. The headlines were hacker-proof drone. That's not exactly true, but by dramatically reducing the surface area and compartmentalizing the security guarantees of this thing, this is a major thing. And people were like, oh, that's kind of cool, and this sort of went on. Like, no, this may be like a fundamentally different way of thinking about what's possible in kind of the consumer space and automotive space, for example. So I don't know if people are broadly aware of this, but the top 4 cloud players are rewriting their network stack, right? So Google, 2 years ago, after Heartbleed, they did a fork of that, and it's called Boring SSL. Amazon's S2N, I think it's Signal to Noise. iOS's Core Crypto and Microsoft's S-Channel. They're all getting refactored and have been undergoing this process for like, a couple years now. But they're actually going through formal verification and proofs of construction for their security properties at the protocol layer. I mean, that's really interesting and exciting. The CyberUL project from Mudge, I've got some other links, as I said, at the bottom. It's definitely worth checking out. The idea is that this will be sort of like a consumer report, like an Underwriter Labs kind of thing, but with, in the consumer security space. So if you have a baby monitor, it's not saying this is like hack-proof, but there's a minimum baseline level of, maybe you shouldn't be using like, Apache 1 and, Telnet with default passwords and things. So there's a whole, the idea is that to really bump up kind of the baseline for consumer product space. Not enough time for these, but I'll leave some links at the end. These are some other cool things if you're into sort of applied crypto and where we might be able to use some of these solutions I mentioned. But really, it comes down to first principles, right? Security, hygiene, trusted supply chain, the root of trust. I saw this by John Lambert from Microsoft. There are simple, I know this isn't a Windows shop, but there are simple policy mitigations that can be done to block an enormous amount of corporate threats. People doing things as simple as kind of a esoteric applications that we don't see in the wild as much, like mapping those to Notepad and other things that are not executable. It's sort of interesting. If there are 4,300 different trusts on your certificate store in your browsers, there are people that have been thinking about, are there ways that we can really reduce this? Maybe I have no business with the Polish government. Maybe I'm in Poland and I have no business with, the Chinese Defense Department, and so some of their certificates and things are not relevant to me, to sort of reducing that. But I also think that we're seeing some interesting, sort of really practical approaches to this as well. If this then that, I mean, why not do simple things like this? If most of the consumer apps that have tie-ins, like authorized apps, did something like this, I think we'd see a whole lot less hacks, right? If instead of, oh yeah, I tied my Tumblr account 5 years ago to Twitter and it's still there and it's active. So sometimes it's thinking simple, not complex. And just remember this picture. And I'll leave it here too. This is something I really want to emphasize to everyone I talk to. I go to these crypto meetings 2 or 3 times a year, some of the best in the world, but sometimes people who have such incredible depth, you hit a point and there's just a cliff of like, I don't know. Your black box is what I do every day, but I don't know. So like, I'm not a protocol guy. Oh yeah, I'm a property preserving encryption expert. I'm a formal methods person. I have no idea about like real world, web server vulnerabilities and things. There is a collection of knowledge that it's encompassing all that to sort of bring these things together. If it feels like when you're working in one of these areas that you're really out of your element, I just like the way this is described, because these are difficult and complicated and deep, deep issues. Right. This is a quote by Matt Blaze I thought was great. If nothing else, this is when the California Apple case was happening. A basic security principle: design your system so that even you can't attack them. If you guys saw Apollo 13, I love this line: I don't care what anything was designed to do, I care about what it can do. That should be your mantra in thinking about security defenses. Don't care what anything was designed to do, care about what it can do. And always be flexible. We're done.
Great. Thank you, Ken. Any questions from the audience? Josh. The catch box might not work. Hang on.
By the way, that was 174 slides, so not bad in just over an hour.
All right, question from the YouTube live stream. This is actually from our CTO, Jono. He's asking how terribly you think we're going to botch TLS 1.3 round trip.
That's a little out of my lane. What I can say is that we're going to botch TLS 1.3 in general in a whole lot of different ways. So one of the best examples is Google, whatever else you think about them, they have some really, really brilliant network engineers that have been thinking about a lot of difficult problems with compatibility and backwards compatibility and things for a long time. I don't know if you guys saw the story maybe 6 weeks ago. A major school system in Maryland, it's called Montgomery County. They're huge. They had hundreds of thousands of Android Chromebooks that just died one day. They're like, what? So Google had turned on TLS 1.3, not because normal mortals use it, because it's not really even enabled in modern browsers, but sort of probing, because monster things like Akamai and Cloudflare, these huge global content distribution systems, have slowly been rolling out TLS 1.3 for a while. Well, it turns out it wasn't the Chromebooks who were barfing on TLS 1.3, it was their man-in-the-middle network box that they had installed at all these schools that went to do the negotiation, and it really is as simple. Hello, I speak TLS 1.0, 1.2, 1.3, or whatever, 1.2. What do you speak? I speak TLS 1.3. And so these admins came in and like hundreds of thousands of kids and teachers' Chromebooks were just like spinning, like, rebooting themselves. So Google had to like turn it off. Anyway, these are not cheap devices. These are multi-$100,000. You get a consultant team army for like 2 years to kind of eke out something that sort of works. So yeah, we're going to be seeing a lot of pain through that. But I don't think it's unique to TLS 1.3. They've gone through a lot of work to get the backwards compatibility right. Corporate America loves their man-in-the-middle boxes, and we'll see. But no, in terms of the Zero RTT, I think that's going to be an instance of this sort of thing where things are going to die inelegantly, but people will patch and move on.
Other questions? Yes.
Does this actually work? Oh.
Hey, it does.
So it was interesting. I mean, I love all the technical stuff and all the man-in-the-middle challenges and all those other things. But of course, many of the security problems that we have seen are human, right? Like John Podesta, oh, by the way, here's my password, things like that.
Right.
So who is doing research on user experience and how that folds into security? Because easier installation of certificates with verification would be one thing. Also making sure that you can verify that whoever is asking you for your password is a legitimate actor, things like that.
Work is going on. I can't say specifically who's doing that. It's kind of outside my lane. I don't know if you can chime in.
Yeah, I mean, I would check out like SUPS, which is the Symposium on Usable Privacy and Security. A lot of great work coming out of like Carnegie Mellon and a lot of other institutions. Chrome security team, especially like on their work on Enamel, which is secure design.
Oh, yeah, right. I wasn't even
presentation.
thinking about it. Right,
Great
yeah.
stuff to check out. Yeah.
Yeah, I know there's a group at IU, at Indiana University, that's thinking about this. But even, it gets a lot of press. I don't know how widespread Signal is like in actual deployment versus WhatsApp and all these other things. But even Signal is like actively hiring designers, because things like you start an encrypted voice call and there's 2 or 3 words and you say those words to the other person, that's brilliant. Why do we go like through all the machinations of PGP awfulness before somebody said, there's this actual usability thing we should think about.
But then you wouldn't get the annual why Johnny can't encrypt rehash.
That's right. That's right.
Other questions? Yeah.
So one of the questions that I had about TLS 1.3, I don't know if you had seen the developments coming from Matthew Green on behalf of US Bank, where they were talking about basically they need to be able to sort of bypass the PPS stuff. They want to be able to, have an option to have static Diffie-Hellman keys in there. So this isn't something that is designed to, sort of improve the end user security. This is, hey, I need to bypass this security feature. So I guess my question is, in terms of the trade-offs that they're making on that, what are your thoughts on that proposed change to TLS 1.3?
I've seen massive outcry and backlash to that, but I wouldn't for a second claim to have any insights into the psyche of the IETF world. It's just, it's like you go in it and then you're just never seen again, except on an email list that go on forever. I actually don't, I'm not too concerned some of those truly last minute, 11th hour requests are actually going to get ratified. I just, having interception by design, it just seems, it's just backwards. That said, if major financial institutions have, people on these committees that have been working in earnest for years, they have a voice. So I'm not too concerned about it, but nothing would surprise me. Which, by the way, and that's one of the reasons that you have 5 different kinds of VPNs, right? You've got IPv6, IKE1, 2, you got LTTP, encapsulation, then you got Cisco's version. Hopefully we won't see something like that with TLS 1.3.
So you touched on the certificate authorities and how we inherently trust them, whether or not they deserve that trust. Are there other ways that are likely to catch on to, provide that trust for browsers and other applications than this model where someone blesses the certificate authority from a central location?
Sure. When I first started, I used to think that the self-signed certificates were like this lazy hack. And the longer I thought about it, I finally realized, no, that's actually in some ways the most secure. If I actually control the endpoints, if I'm able to, with full spread on all mobile devices and all desktops, put my keys on, that's sort of the best situation, right? And it's not just browsers, right? So don't get browser-centric. On any given Linux box, there's 5, 10, 30 certificate stores. Every app may come with one, which may or may not have gotten updated in the last 2 years, which may or may not be Heartbleed still vulnerable. Help us. We see that all the time. But Wendy and I were talking just earlier. There is this notion of, the certificate authorities are voting to drop it down to 30 days, 60 days. These are serious discussions. So this notion of like truly long-term, 3-year, trusted on high, I think people are sort of thinking about, there are different ways to do that. Yeah.
Other questions? Okay.
All right, one more from YouTube. What's the most promising, interesting, or important new crypto defense you see coming down the pike in the next few years? Differential crypto, or privacy rather, PIR, which I believe is private information retrieval, or something else?
Yeah, some of the differential privacy stuff is really interesting. So I don't know if people follow this so much, but there's Apple, among others, is shipping really powerful neural net code on devices because modern mobile devices are actually getting pretty speedy. They've got an entire R&D group thinking about ways to do this, where you can, for example, do public health type surveillance, but preserving preserving the protections of identity. I say promising because it's actually shipping, and there's some interesting health applications coming out of it. There may be dozens of other things that just not on my radar, but that's something to definitely keep on the lookout for.
Yeah.
Hey, I was curious in terms of like the Google Beyond Corp stuff. I'm not sure if you got to see or okay. Just was wondering if you had seen it or had any comments on it.
I don't know.
Oh, we're all about that here.
Okay.
It's also why I thought it'd be maybe good.
So a lot of this deep into how these work, how they're flawed, and how we're trying to do better is fascinating and all. But for a lot of people in DevOps and the security analysis, design, information assurance, incident response type stuff, a lot of that is inaccessible. We have what we have, and we're doing what we're doing. Do you have any thoughts or words, wisdom that you could share regarding, communities that we can touch base with, security benchmarks for the applications that we have, and things like that, in order to reduce the likelihood that threat actors could potentially take advantage of vulnerabilities in the configurations of our systems?
Right. That's a great question. So the question was around sort of getting acclimated to deeper areas of security awareness, what communities, what resources. I think that's sort of where you're going, and then actually what are actionable things you can do to sort of make progress there. One thing that people are doing, I think it's been happening for a long time, but they're talking more about it, are these tabletop scenarios right? There are actually Twitter bots now with tabletop scenarios. So one of the tabletop scenarios is your DNS got owned. Let's pick GoDaddy because they're GoDaddy, and somebody for some period of time put up a phishing page, but with your domain name and with your certs, and your employees or your customers were entering their credentials, and you just discovered it. What do you do? Wow. So that's just one example, but these sort of scenarios to go through to really push hard about, okay, well, what does our incident response look like, and what does our risk profile really look like, and what is our PR strategy here, and have we really thought, yeah, we know network segmentation is important, but we didn't really do it. A lot of the benefits of those kinds of scenarios are, it's multidisciplinary. You have a lot of different people with different hats on the table thinking about problems when you have time to breathe and think. One of the most valuable things I ever did when I was more into the data architecture space, I was on a project, I was just out of school, and the managing VP was like, none of you 12 people know anything about Oracle, and it really ticks me off because we're billing out huge rates that say that you know what you're doing with Oracle. So we're going to send you to Oracle headquarters for like 6 weeks of boot camp. Okay, but one of the things that Oracle brilliantly does when they train their DBAs in-house is you drill again and again and again. You do these labs where data files are corrupted, where backups are corrupted, where archive read logs are corrupted, and you sit at the keyboard and you fix it. And you do it again and again and again until it's just automatic. Now, we can't predict, all the different scenarios, but you can get a lot of insights and a lot of interesting ideas from these tabletop scenarios. So I think that's one place to start. There's countless possibilities for, kind of community things. I would probably not recommend the DEF CON and Black Hats of the world. I would recommend, in terms of operational stuff, there are lots of interesting things around security automation, security DevOps kind of things that are the sort of less, they get less attention, but it's what real-world defenders are doing right now, like what's actually working. How are people using Vault, for example, to do tokenization? What are people using with Google Compute Engine and AWS with their key management systems and cloud key management? And what works, what's painful, what's not, and then how do they implement those? So there's different creative ways to do that. But I think thinking through some of the worst possible things is a great way to kind of, get these conversations going.
Any other questions for Ken? Any other questions for Ken? Yeah. All right. Are there any VPNs you like, Ken?
Yeah. So I'm actually giving an entire talk at the International Crypto Module Conference in May in DC. But the preview of that is, it's a very short piece of advice, which is, if you're in this room, you're probably capable of running your own. And if you're going to run your own, don't look at blogs, don't look at, your cousin's advice and stuff. Look at some of the best people in the world who do mobile security for a living at a really, at depth. And those people are from the Signal team, and they're from the Trail of Bits team and this sort of thing. So Streisand and Alco VPN, two of the strongest curated, well-maintained, mature, sane security defaults. You can set up an Algo or a Streisand in an hour or two. It's easy to do. If you're asking me, what do you tell your cousin that bugs you at holiday dinners, there are a couple decent companies that seem to have decent anti-features, right? What they don't promise and what they are very particular about, saying these are the pieces of information we keep. And yes, if we're served within a court order, of course we're going to do that. If a company brags about Bitcoin and anonymity and not logging, I don't believe them, and I don't think you should use them. Cloak and TunnelBear are two services that have engaged outside credible third-party firms I've seen the audits from one of those organizations, and they've done a lot of work to improve their posture. But more importantly, the fact that they even asked for that help puts them in the 99th percentile in the industry. If you follow me on Twitter, occasionally I'll post updates and things, but yeah, I'd say the vast majority of consumer VPN services are either actively malicious or incompetent or both. And even if they have elements of a tech stack that are okay, they're offering terribly insecure defaults for a good part of their customer base, and they just don't care. And search engine optimization gaming, these are 7, 8-figure ad buys. Best VPN, recommended VPN, those are 7, 8-figure ad buys on AdSense. So I mean, if you start with Google and get, PC Magazine and sort of editorial reviews, they just don't have the capability to make any kind of security assessment. They're going to go on features and price, and this one's $12.95, but this one's $6.95. So that's their number 2 Editor's Choice Award. Like, wow, okay.
Cool. Any last questions? All right, so I just want to thank everybody for attending tonight. I want to thank Ken for coming up to Ann Arbor, so let's give Ken a round of applause. Great. Thank you all again for coming, and just be on the lookout for the next Tech Talk announcement on the Meetup site. Thank you.
Thanks.